Good morning, everyone. I'm Mayor Garcetti, and welcome to this session of the Resilience Advantage series, exploring the relationship between resilience and sustainability. In Los Angeles, we know how closely these two issues are linked, and we understand that the decisions we make today are going to shape the lives of our children and our grandchildren. That's why we're working to source more of our water and power locally, why we're working to build a more resilient and more prepared city. Together with our partners, we created an early earthquake warning system that has been adopted now statewide. And we focused on seismic retrofit programs for buildings and water, conveyance systems, as well as telecommunication infrastructure. And we vastly expanded our emergency preparedness programs, so families throughout our city and neighborhoods everywhere, and our business community will be ready to respond in a crisis and be more aware of how to help one another. Let me thank everyone who has helped to put this Resilience Advantage series together, including the U.S. Resilience Council, Optimum Seismic, LA Chamber, BizFed, and LA EDC. And thank you to all the members of our business and building communities who are participating today. Thank you for the action you will take to learn more about resilience. You see, if everyone does their part, Los Angeles will be more prepared, better equipped to emerge from any challenge better than before. And together, I know we will make Los Angeles stronger and more resilient. Thank you.
Welcome to the Resilience Advantage, a series brought to you by the U.S. Resiliency Council and Optimum Seismic. I'm your host, Evan Reese. In this episode, we'll be exploring what resilience means to the long-term sustainability of our communities in the face of natural disasters like earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, wildfire, and now even pandemics. It's a sobering reality that the impacts of natural disasters are increasing in the United States and around the world as a function of both climate change and infrastructure growth in high-hazard areas. Camilla Seth is Managing Director of the Finance Hub, a leader in conservation finance, and also a member of the U.S. Resiliency Council's Board of Directors. We recruited her to join us out of a recognition of the essential need to expand the conception of sustainable design and climate change, to also include disaster prevention and mitigation.
There's no question that the frequency and severity of natural disasters has increased, and that the impact on communities is no longer something that we can't focus on or only focus on in terms of relief. We are already into, whether it's climate resilience or other types of sustainability issues that we need to adapt to.
California legislator Adrian Nazarian, representing the San Fernando Valley, explains how the Northridge earthquake in 1994 affected every aspect of the community, and how without a change in practices, things will be worse when the next inevitable extreme event occurs.
What happened in '94, we saw the displacement that it caused in our educational institutions, our business production, our daily routine activities. We saw the impacts, we saw the devastation of the cost, and that was at a time where the buildings that were around at that time were not as old as they are now. Now, 26 some years later, you can imagine how much more vulnerable we are. And what's very scary is that at a time like this, with the housing crunch that we have many individuals, vulnerable individuals, living in the most vulnerable buildings that will be the first to be impacted by earthquakes.
The severity of natural disasters in the U.S. is straining even our capacity to rebuild and recover from them. Our communities seem to be falling behind decade after decade, particularly for the most vulnerable. Lori Schumann is Senior Program Director for Resilience at Enterprise Community Partners, which has led the way for decades on housing and economic development in the U.S. states and territories like Puerto Rico.
You know, Katrina occurred about 14 years ago, and still much of the Ninth Ward has not been repaired. We still see damage from Superstorm Sandy from New York, and this is New York City, which thinks of itself as the most advanced bureaucracy in the country. We also know that it's very difficult to rebuild affordable housing. A lot of communities reject the rebuilding of affordable housing after an event. If we look at Galveston, Texas, close to 80% of its affordable housing was lost from Hurricane Ike, and not even 60% of that has been rebuilt.
Ultimately, we have to recognize that we cannot avoid our way out of the impacts of climate change. We've crossed the Rubicon, where we must learn to live with at least some of its effects. Organizations like the U.S. Green Building Council Los Angeles and its executive director Ben Stapleton are taking on this new aspect of the sustainability challenge.
I think the conversation has shifted over the last few years, and rightfully so. Look, I'd love to say that we can change as a society and turn the Titanic here a little bit to avoid the greatest impacts of climate change, and I'm still a believer in that. I've been doing this work for a long time now, but I think it'd be foolish if we weren't looking at how do we adapt as well. We have to learn how do we adapt while we try to save and prepare for a future that's going to be a little different.
Beyond the lessons we've learned from climate disasters and earthquakes, the impacts of COVID-19 have taught us that investing in preparedness is essential if we're going to limit the devastation from the next extreme event.
These kinds of large systemic disruptions, whether they're in the health arena or in natural disasters that affect the built environment, they are coming and they are going to continue to come.
It's critical for us to think about how we're taking the appropriate steps to protect our investments, our loved ones, and the continuous ability in the future to conduct business the way we have been and to not be hampered by a major seismic event.
Addressing problems, particularly the infrastructure challenges, brick and mortar challenges, before an event is fundamentally the most cost-effective and prudent way to ensure that communities will be safeguarded after the event.
We discussed in previous episodes of this Resilience Advantage series that in a typical city, 80 to 90% of the building stock was built prior to the development of modern building codes. It's simply not economically or socially practical to rebuild all of our vulnerable buildings. It's also not environmentally wise.
Existing buildings are a huge part of this issue. In fact, I often think there's far too much focus on new buildings. 1 to 2% of our buildings are new on an annual basis. We tend to focus on that and focus on the code that addresses those and very little on the existing building stock. You know, from a sustainability standpoint, the highest and best use of an existing building is to find out how to use what's already there.
Architects and other design professionals have been working on new ways to measure sustainability and find ways to achieve it.
You know, there's this concept of operational carbon and embodied carbon. The operational carbon is really what it takes to run an asset. That's the concrete, the steel, the glass, the carpet, you know, all the elements of that building, those materials. There's an embodied carbon to really create those. And one of the things I've been really encouraged by over the past few years is we've started to have a lot more transparency around the embodied carbon in materials.
In 2012, Superstorm Sandy left more than 10 million tons of debris in its wake. All that debris had to be hauled by smog-spewing trucks to landfills, where it will sit and leach toxic chemicals into the air and water for decades. And then, 10 million tons of new building materials had to be created to replace the buildings that were destroyed. So really, how sustainable is a building if the environmental cost at the end of its life far surpasses any environmental savings it might have achieved during its life?
There's a Venn diagram of sustainability and resilience, and I think there's a significant amount of overlap. To me, in order to be a truly sustainable society or have a truly sustainable building, that means that it's resilient. That's how it's going to be sustained long term.
One of the clearest examples of the negative social and economic impacts of natural disasters and their extreme cost to the environment were the back-to-back earthquakes that occurred in Christchurch, New Zealand in 2010 and 2011. Brendan Winder works for the city of Christchurch, helping to manage the ongoing recovery from the twin earthquakes. Brendan, what was it like to drive into Christchurch following the second and larger earthquake in February 2011?
It had been a very significant earthquake, and I was beginning to see large buildings badly damaged, large trees had fallen over. It was sort of on the way into town, it gradually became very apparent the scale of the earthquake was significant. There was somewhere in the region of 500,000 to 1 million truck movements from the city. So on roads that weren't particularly designed for trucks, through suburbs that don't normally see demolition trucks moving at all. Lots of people put effort into bundling stuff up in containers and sending it off to Pacific Islands and other parts of the world that could do with some of this material. Some of it was carted around the country, and a lot of it was put into landfill, unfortunately, and no one wanted to do that, but the economics didn't stack up.
A recent documentary described a 25-meter tall mound that was created to store all of the debris generated by the earthquakes. When building debris is hauled off to a landfill after a natural disaster, there often isn't time to remove and properly dispose of toxic chemicals and materials that are part of any building.
But when buildings come down, when they collapse or when they're demolished, it releases a whole lot of fibre asbestos into the air, and that had to be managed. So there was a whole heap of work done on how we could do that quickly, but in a safe manner as well. So, one of the other things that happens in this environment, as you'll understand, with the number of buildings coming down, is we need to cut up concrete. And in some cases, you can just crush it. In other cases, you actually need to cut the concrete. And concrete dust in itself is a health risk.
If there's a silver lining to this story, it may be that Christchurch and New Zealand have learned a valuable lesson about the importance of resilient design. Engineering, construction, and city planning practices have changed so that when the next earthquake inevitably strikes the country, its buildings will perform better and its cities will recover more quickly.
But we've got to learn the lessons from these emergencies, and putting back vulnerable houses and vulnerable communities back into vulnerable parts of the countryside is just dumb. So we need to take the smart long-term view. If we are going to build back, let's just build better. So how do we put in better housing in better places and ensuring better outcomes?
It's a painful way to learn such an important lesson, and hopefully other countries are wise enough not to wait until such a disaster strikes them before taking action. The good news is that the goals of green and sustainable design are mutually possible and beneficial. Cities like Los Angeles and business leaders worldwide have begun to embed sustainability in their organizational structures and culture via internal sustainability policies and the establishment of C-suite positions like Chief Sustainability Officer. Increasingly, disaster resilience is being considered as a complementary necessity to those efforts.
In fact, with the city's resilience plan and the city's sustainability plan, there is a ton of overlapping goals. And those goals can make for a more efficient city, make a more resilient city, and a more sustainable city.
We talked with Michelle Jones of RIM Architects about how this is affecting client demand and satisfaction in some of her projects.
I think that's really important for our clients to understand. They're looking at how long they're holding the asset, what their current initial investment, their CapEx cost is, and they're looking for the basis to understand how that's going to spread over the life of the building.
Another disturbing future that COVID-19 foreshadows is the potential cumulative and cascading impacts when multiple systemic shocks might happen at the same time. Just consider the social and economic impacts COVID-19 has wrought on our world, this without damage to a single building. It takes an entire nation dedicated and focused on combating the pandemic in order to be successful. Jurisdictions, philanthropists, nonprofits, financial institutions, researchers, and consultants all need to recognize the interconnectedness around the goals of resilience and then get involved.
So resilience is really a community effort. We as a city, I as a city, the mayor as a city, can't do it all alone. It really takes partnerships, and resilience really builds on itself.
Over the last 20 years, there has been an incredibly significant change in the degree to which philanthropy has been working outside of the nonprofit sector, but also with business and communities around issues of sustainability and how to embed them into markets and finance. Being in the middle of a crisis like we're in is, in fact, putting a big bright light around this issue of resilience and preparedness.
Ben Stapleton spoke with me about the genesis of the Green Movement and how the development of tools such as building performance rating systems to measure and communicate resilience can advance the conversation about what's achievable.
You know, essentially, everyone needs a roadmap, right, and a guide to figure out how to get the structure in place to achieve goals. You know, if you think back to, you know, the 90s, there just wasn't that in existence, right? People really need to figure out, what was a shared common plan to address how do we green an asset? How do we provide some rigor to that process? And then informing that rigor, the LEED system, has bronze, silver, gold levels. It has a base level. That rigor allows there to be some ranking and some ultimately certification on what people are doing.
What can the resilience movement learn from the successes and even some of the missteps of the green movement over the past 20 years?
I think what hurt the green movement to begin with is that it was too much about this is the right thing to do. Yes, it's the right thing to do, but we should be really focusing on the ROI, on that return on investment, and looking at the economic model. And I think that's a lesson that resilience can take from this. I think for resilience, there needs to be a discussion around, there's a tangible ROI for us to build a resilient asset versus a non-resilient asset.
Several national studies have shown that resilient design of new buildings and the mitigation of our existing inventories makes good business sense. This has gained the attention of our political leaders.
When you know that if you put $1 today in the bank, it's not going to become $4 tomorrow, but the $1 of investment towards seismic retrofit helps save $4 tomorrow, then that's a no-brainer. The alternative cost isn't high enough to warrant us not to make this investment. We need to make this investment.
By showing that resilience is good business, we can change minds and spur action over and above just the idea that resilience is a moral imperative.
In resilience, we need to do the same thing and really focus on that ROI and have this not be about, hey, this is the best thing you should be doing to prepare yourself in the event of a disaster. It should be like, no, this is what's increasing the value of your asset long term and giving you a better portfolio.
We're seeing that a focus on resiliency is really complementary to what we're already doing with LEED. And it's also becoming prevalent in how our clients are looking at their projects, how they design spaces to connect with their people, to support their people, be able to operate their businesses, and be able to respond in case there is some type of a catastrophic event.
The U.S. Green Building Council, the developer of the LEED rating system, recently unveiled a new standard called RELY. The RELY standard is looking beyond green design to sustainability that includes resilience. The U.S. Resiliency Council's Building Performance Rating System for earthquakes has been adopted as a component of RELY.
I think the RELY program is, I think it's a benefit that USRC is a component of that. And I think that if we can continue to spread the word on this, it's going to pick up momentum just like LEED has.
Lori Schumann of Enterprise expressed excitement over the role that approaches like RELY and the U.S. Resiliency Council's three-dimension 5-star rating system can play.
A rating system will help us start the conversation about how to quantify their risk and quantify their improvements. We are desperate for a way to quantify the return on investment for this work. So a rating system would help us start thinking about a benchmark. And a benchmark is what we need in the industry to help us think about where buildings are at with respect to their resiliency. The rating system will not only help the owners, it'll help the regulators and the program directors and the housing departments figure out where their greatest vulnerability is as they seek investment.
One of the keys to success is to make resilience a part of the design process right from the beginning. Another important component of a successful resilience strategy is our ability to gain support from a broad array of stakeholder groups, including the private, public, and philanthropic sectors. The most influential expression of that support can come through incentives to motivate owners to invest in resilience. Jonathan Cohen is a developer and historic building advocate in Portland, Oregon, and co-owner of a recently retrofitted hotel that achieved a USRC Silver rating. We asked him what would help developers become more receptive to increasing the resilience of existing buildings.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think the answer in the current environment is just cash. It could be preferable loan terms or a really favorable loan to assist with that. And we need some real policymakers above the level of administrative folks at the planning agencies to support this.
There's still a lot of innovation that can be used in financing. I worked on some of the PACE financing, so the property assessed financing for clean energy and energy efficiency retrofits here in LA County. I actually really think that's a good model. I think this concept of improvements to buildings that have a public benefit, and in my mind that includes efficiency and sustainability improvements.
I think it's critical that the state takes appropriate steps to further incentivize local jurisdictions to want to also go that route. And so I think it's going to be very important for the state to come up with incentive programs, whether through tax credits or loan programs, to ensure that local jurisdictions are taking advantage of these programs and then further either incentivizing or requiring their businesses and residents to make the upgrades necessary for their safety.
I think what we've learned is that for the big pressing problems, you need action from all sides. You need collaboration across government, philanthropy, and business. And the unique role of philanthropy is to identify something that has not been sufficiently addressed and to seed new ideas and to help get them to scale to a point where perhaps government funding will come in and kick it to the next level.
We began this episode with the reality of the increased occurrence and severity of natural hazards as a result of population exposure, climate change, and other forces. Past disasters like Sandy, Katrina, and many other hurricanes, as well as the Northridge and Christchurch earthquakes, demonstrate the environmental and socioeconomic consequences of past building practices and the magnitude of the future catastrophes we face if we don't change our approach now. Private and public organizations, communities, philanthropies, businesses, and design professionals are all finding ways to advance both green and resilient design. But we need more collective action to educate and incentivize these investments in our future. We invite you to view other episodes in the Resilience Advantage series to learn about the benefits of resilient design and to join us in advancing this critical movement towards true sustainability. In our next episode, we'll look at the science and technology that is making resilience possible and affordable. I hope you'll join us on the Resilience Advantage.